The clinking of goblets, the laughter of nobles, the scent of roasted meat filling the air, yet behind the glittering glow of medieval feasts lurked something far more sinister than any battlefield. In fact, statistics whispered a cruel truth. A knight was safer charging into arrows than accepting a dinner invitation. If that sounds unbelievable, stay with me, because the story of poisoned chalices, treacherous toasts, and smiling assassins will make you think twice before raising your glass. And before we continue, if you dare to uncover the darkest truths hidden in history, hit subscribe now. This banquet of betrayal is only beginning. For nobles of the Middle Ages, the dinner table was no sanctuary. Bread was blessed, wine was sacred, and hospitality was supposed to be holy. Yet, political ambition twisted this sacred trust into a weapon. To be invited to a noble's feast was both an honor and a risk, for the very people who toasted your health might be calculating your death between courses. Knights may have polished their armor for jousts and wars, but the real duels of survival often happened in candlelit halls. Poison replaced arrows, honey replaced swords, and betrayal replaced open combat. Imagine lifting a goblet smiling at your host, only to feel your throat tighten as laughter around the table drowns out your last breath. In 1448, Byzantine Emperor John VIII Palaiologos thought he was celebrating victory. The hall rang with music banners of triumph hung above, and wine was poured freely. But his cup was sweeter than usual. By the third course, his hands trembled. By dessert, he convulsed on marble floors while his advisors looked on with carefully neutral expressions. His toast to victory had become his death sentence. The sweetness was no accident. Arsenic mixed with honey, a poisoner's favorite disguise, masked the metallic taste and ensured a dramatic, unforgettable death. These killers were not reckless. They were artists of suffering timing every symptom to unfold before an audience. Death was spectacle, and the banquet was their theater. France had its own macabre culinary traditions. In 1354, King Charles VI wanted his brother-in-law dead. The solution: a magnificent roasted peacock feathers reattached for flair, stuffed with herbs soaked in mercury. The Count of Ayr, flattered by the royal delicacy, praised the dish even as his nervous system shut down. He died 3 days later, still complimenting the seasoning that killed him. Poisoners understood psychology as much as chemistry. They knew pride would keep victims seated, smiling through pain, unwilling to appear weak in front of rivals. To stand up coughing or leave a meal early was an admission of fear, and in the brutal chess game of medieval politics, fear could kill you faster than poison. But poison was only one chapter in this sinister cookbook. Sometimes subtlety was abandoned entirely. Hosts wanted their message to be loud, bloody, and unforgettable. In Scotland, 1440, young William Douglas and his brother David walked into Edinburgh Castle dressed in finery, expecting celebration. Instead, they found a bull's head placed on the high table, the symbol of death. Before they could process the omen, guards seized them. Guests sat frozen, the festive music falling silent as the children were dragged to the courtyard. There, under torchlight, the boys were executed, beheaded on the spot. Their only crime: belonging to a family too powerful for their host's ambitions. The dinner was not a feast, but a trap. The surviving diners returned to their plates in horrified silence, every bite now tasting of fear. They understood what had just been staged before them, a warning carved into memory with steel and blood. To defy your host was to die, and to dine was to gamble with your life. But Scotland was not alone in turning a dinner invitation into a death warrant. Across the Channel in England, Edward IV extended what seemed like an olive branch to the Earl of Devon and his son in 1461. The invitation promised reconciliation after years of civil war. The setting was warm, the food rich, the wine flowing, yet the silence of absent nobles should have been a warning. Halfway through the meal, the sound of clashing steel shattered the illusion. Edward's soldiers flooded the hall, blades drawn. The father and son were cut down before the main course had even cooled. Their blood mixed with spilled wine, and the hall that moments earlier echoed with laughter now rang with screams. Such betrayals were not reserved for enemies. Weddings, those supposed unions of love and peace, often became theaters of massacre. Guests arrived unarmed, their guard lowered in joy. Tables glittered with jewels, laughter sparkled through the hall. But in more than one medieval marriage, the vows were followed not by dancing, but by slaughter. This irony was immortalized centuries later in Game of Thrones' infamous Red Wedding. Yet George R.R. Martin had only borrowed from reality. History itself was littered with blood-stained wedding halls where the bride became a widow and the groom a corpse before the musicians finished their first song. Why were feasts such perfect ambushes? Because food symbolized trust. Once you accepted bread and wine, you were bound by sacred law, your host sworn to protect you. To break this law was to commit a crime not just against man, but against God, which is precisely why ambitious nobles found it irresistible. King John of England, infamous for his cruelty, knew this well. In 1208, he invited his once loyal ally, William de Braos, and family to a feast at Corfe Castle. Promises of peace sweetened the air. Old jokes were retold, familiar smiles exchanged. De Braos likely thought at last the storm had passed. Then John raised his goblet. Instead of pardons, he announced treason charges. Instead of reconciliation, he offered starvation. The family was dragged to the dungeons beneath their feet. While they starved to death in darkness, John held more feasts directly above them, the sounds of revelry mocking their slow demise. In Byzantium, betrayal wore an even subtler mask. Emperor Michael III often dined with his commander Nikephoros Botaniates in 1078. They drank wine, shared war stories, even exchanged gifts for the emperor's children. But every toast was a step toward betrayal. For Botaniates was buying guards, mapping corridors, and planning a coup. Over months of meals, trust deepened and then snapped. Within weeks of their final dinner, Botaniates dethroned Michael the Emperor, undone not by battlefield defeat, but by the intimacy of shared bread and wine. In Byzantium, as across Europe, the greater the friendship, the deadlier the feast. It was a cruel paradox. The closer you sat to the host, the nearer you were to your grave. In medieval courts, breaking bread often meant breaking necks. And the most chilling truth, your smiling dinner companion, the one who laughed at your stories, might already be planning your funeral before dessert was served. The art of assassination through food reached its twisted perfection in Italy. By the late Middle Ages, the Borgias elevated poisoning from a crude tool into a carefully choreographed dance. Cesare Borgia didn't invent the dinner party murder, he refined it with flair and precision that made earlier killers look clumsy. But the groundwork had been laid centuries earlier. Medieval poisoners already knew which mushrooms mimicked heart failure, how mercury poisoning could be mistaken for natural illness, and which herbs could linger for weeks before delivering death. They lacked the Borgias' theatricality, but the science of murder was already thriving. One of the earliest papal deaths suspected of foul play was that of Pope John VIII in 882. His enemies laced his wine with ground glass and slow-acting toxins. He blamed age and stress as his body failed, never realizing his stomach was being shredded from within. No medieval physician could tell murder from divine punishment. The trick worked so well because medical knowledge was limited. If a noble collapsed, it was easy to blame gout bad humors or God's wrath. For poisoners, ignorance was their greatest ally. And in courts obsessed with appearances, victims often smiled until the end, desperate not to betray weakness. Paranoia soon became part of dining culture. Food tasters were employed. Servants were forced to sample dishes before nobles took a bite, and antidotes were kept close at hand. But poisoners were always one step ahead, changing formulas, disguising symptoms, and timing deaths with political precision. In France, one poisoned cantarella was whispered about like a ghost. Made from arsenic and pig's blood, it was said to kill slowly, ensuring victims wasted away in silence. Some swore it left a faint smell of bitter almonds. Others claimed it mimicked natural decline so well that even priests believed the deaths were holy. The true horror was psychological. Imagine a man at a feast, stomach burning, vision blurring, yet still forcing a smile, still lifting his goblet to thank his host. Pride demanded silence even as the poison carved its way through his veins. Death was agony, but so was the awareness of betrayal. Hospitality laws were meant to prevent such horrors. In Norse and Slavic traditions, once bread and salt were shared, the guest was untouchable. Breaking this vow was seen as monstrous. Yet ambition proved stronger than piety. To weaponize hospitality itself was the ultimate show of power. Harald Hardrada, the legendary Norwegian king, learned this lesson fatally. In 1066, before his final battle, he attended what he thought was a strategy feast with Earl Tostig. Trusting the sanctity of hospitality, Harald let his guard drop. But Tostig had already betrayed him, leaking his location to enemies. Harald escaped the dinner, but the intelligence gathered sealed his doom weeks later. Such stories reveal the most chilling truth: the ritual of hospitality was never abandoned. Nobles still blessed bread, offered the best seats, and poured wine with steady hands before orchestrating slaughter. The betrayal was deliberate, sharpened by the contrast between sacred ritual and profane murder. Chroniclers described banquet deaths with a strange mixture of horror and fascination. They wrote of nobles collapsing mid-toast, clutching their cups with trembling fingers, their final words still dripping with courtesy. It was as if etiquette itself had been weaponized, forcing victims to smile through the agony of betrayal. In some accounts, guests swore they heard the faint scratching of nails against goblets as poisoned men tried to hold on, unwilling to drop their wine and reveal weakness. Others remembered the eerie silence that fell across the hall, broken only by the shuffle of servants who dared not intervene. This silence was not accidental. It was cultivated. Hosts wanted their guests to watch, to learn. Every noble at the table knew they could be next, and that obedience was the only shield against a fate as humiliating as it was painful. Murder became performance, and every audience left terrified. Even when poison was not used, feasts could still turn into death traps. Servants carried more than platters. They carried swords. The positioning of guests at the table became a strategy. The closer to the host, the greater the danger. A seat of honor was often a seat of doom. By the late Middle Ages, nobles learned to read a banquet hall like a battlefield. A missing ally, a strange silence, guards lingering too near the doors, all were clues. Yet paranoia rarely saved them. Once the gates closed and the wine flowed, even the sharpest eye could not escape fate. Imagine the sensory assault. The sweet smell of spiced wine masking the bitterness of arsenic, the heavy perfume of roasted meat covering the acrid tang of mercury, the echo of laughter hiding the quick gasp of a victim. Every feast was a labyrinth of scents and sounds concealing death. One Venetian report described a noble who began sweating profusely during a feast, dabbing his brow while laughing louder than anyone else. His companions thought he was drunk, but by dawn he was dead. The poison had done its work, silently masked by the very rituals of revelry. The cruelest twist was that the victims often realized too late. The moment the metallic tang reached their tongue or the heat spread through their chest. Suspicion dawned, but pride kept them seated. To accuse a host was to risk immediate slaughter, and so they chose dignity over desperate flight. This psychological torment, knowing betrayal had come from the very hand that served you, was perhaps more painful than the poison itself. The victim died twice, once from venom and once from broken trust. Medieval nobles understood this and wielded it like a blade sharper than any dagger. And so, by the 15th century, banquets had become arenas of fear. Every invitation was a gamble. Every toast could be the last. For while war threatened the body, feasts threatened the soul, because at the table, your enemy wore the smiling face of a friend. The banquet table was a chessboard, and every dish a move in a deadly game. Nobles understood this, yet still they came because refusing an invitation was itself dangerous. To decline was to insult the host, and insult could mean war. Better to risk poison than to guarantee open enmity. This cruel logic explains why so many walked willingly into their own deaths. It was a choice between silent suspicion and public defiance. And in a world where appearances were everything, nobles often chose silence even if it killed them. In Burgundy, whispers told of Duke Philip the Good's court, where rumors of poison swirled like smoke. Guests smiled, laughed, and applauded performances, yet every sip of wine brought a flicker of doubt. Chroniclers noted that even the duke's closest allies sometimes avoided food altogether, feigning illness to escape the risk. But hosts anticipated these evasions. To refuse a dish could also be deadly an insult that marked one as disloyal. Thus, nobles balanced on a razor's edge, eat and risk death, or refuse and invite it faster. It was etiquette turned into a death sentence. Some rulers thrived in this climate of terror. They weaponized uncertainty, making their court a place where fear was constant seasoning. The faintest hesitation, the smallest cough, the quickest glance could spiral into panic. Banquets became tests of loyalty, with every gesture scrutinized like evidence in a trial. Stories tell of men sweating over their soup wives, clutching their husbands' sleeves under the table, children peering wide-eyed at the silence that fell each time a goblet was raised. The feast was not celebration. It was a ritual of fear dressed in silks and garnished with blood. One French chronicler described a feast where musicians played louder and louder to cover the sound of retching in the corner. The host kept smiling, lifting his glass, never acknowledging the victim. The guests joined in pretending not to notice their laughter, forced and hollow. Survival depended on pretending nothing was wrong. This charade only made the cruelty sharper. Victims often died not only in pain but in isolation, surrounded by people too terrified to help. To watch a friend convulse while clapping to the rhythm of music was a psychological torture unique to the banquet hall, and yet there were always whispers of revenge. Poisoners sometimes overplayed their hand, their methods too obvious, their motives too transparent. Families took note. Blood feuds ignited. Entire dynasties collapsed because one feast ended with too many empty chairs. But the deadliest banquet was yet to come. For in Renaissance Italy, the Borgias transformed what was already a nightmare into an art form so polished, so theatrical, that it made medieval poisoners look like amateurs. The feast of betrayal was about to reach its climax. The Borgias inherited centuries of perfected murder techniques, but they gave them spectacle. Where medieval nobles hid their poison in silence, the Borgias orchestrated death like theater. Timing, dosage, and even the victim's social standing were carefully considered, ensuring the banquet hall became their private stage. Cesare Borgia was said to smile as he poured wine, his charm disarming, his words flattering. Guests who drank from his goblet often praised the vintage, never realizing the flavor of almonds hinted at arsenic. To drink with Cesare was to gamble your life against his ambitions. Legends tell of entire feasts where half the table died before dawn, while the other half lived to spread whispers of the family's terrifying reach. To be invited was both honor and threat. Decline, and you risked insult. Accept, and you risked death. But Cesare was not unique. He was simply the culmination of an older tradition. Across Europe, rulers treated poison not as a crime, but as a legitimate political tool. Chronicles spoke of antimony mimicking heart attacks, snake venom dissolved into wine herbs that delayed death for weeks. Each new method was an innovation in terror. The Pope himself was not immune. One account describes a feast where Pope Alexander VI allegedly raised a chalice unaware it had been prepared for his enemies. Whether by accident or divine irony, the poison meant for others touched the lips of the host. His slow, agonizing decline became proof that no one, not even the head of Christendom, was safe. By now, paranoia shaped every aspect of dining. Tables were rearranged, servants watched like spies, and tasters were forced to sip each cup. Yet no matter how elaborate the precautions, poisoners adapted faster. For every antidote, a new toxin emerged. For every ritual, a new deception was born. Imagine the atmosphere, flickering candlelight reflecting off goblets, the smell of wax mingling with roasted venison, whispers weaving through the hall like smoke. A sudden silence when a guest coughs. a musician's lute string snapping, echoing like a warning. The feast was no longer joy, it was suspense. One Florentine guest recalled his hands trembling each time he lifted his cup. He swore he could hear his own heartbeat louder than the laughter around him. Every sip was a test of courage. Every swallow felt like a step closer to the grave, and when death came, it was almost always hidden behind politeness. A noble collapsing with a smile thanking his host as his lips turned pale. A woman excusing herself quietly, never returning. Etiquette demanded grace even in dying. The performance had to continue. But these were not isolated tragedies. They reshaped entire societies. Families fell kingdoms, shifted alliances, dissolved all because of a poisoned feast. The banquet was no longer just a meal. It was a weapon of mass destruction sharpened by ambition and disguised as hospitality. As centuries passed, chronicles kept returning to the same truth. The banquet was more dangerous than the battlefield. Kings, cardinals, generals, many who survived countless wars, fell not to swords, but to goblets. The irony became almost a proverb, better to march into arrows than to dine with rivals. The horror lay not only in death, but in its staging. Feasts were meant to unite, to bless marriages, to honor victories. Yet these same tables became altars of betrayal. Bread once sacred was poisoned, wine once holy became venom. The perversion was deliberate, mocking the very sanctity it defiled. Guests learned to read the smallest details. A host's smile held too long, a servant's nervous glance, a dish served slightly late. Yet even the most suspicious noble could not escape the trap. Once the doors closed, once the candles burned, survival belonged to chance and poisoner alike. For every famous death recorded, countless others vanished without note. Servants poisoned to silence rumors. Minor lords dispatched quietly over venison. Women eliminated at wedding feasts, their screams drowned by music. The banquet was a killing ground not only for the powerful, but for anyone who stood in the way. Still, the tradition of hospitality endured. Bread was still blessed. Salt still shared hands, still clasped in false friendship. The ritual gave betrayal its sharpest edge. To break divine law so openly was a declaration of absolute power. It said, not even God can protect you here. Chroniclers describe victims dying in disbelief, whispering prayers as they fell. Some clutched crucifixes, others begged their hosts with wide eyes. Few found mercy. The lesson carved into history was simple in politics. Trust was suicide. Friendship could kill faster than enmity. By the late Middle Ages, rulers carried their paranoia forward into Renaissance courts. Elaborate tasting rituals, silver utensils to detect arsenic tasters forced to eat before every bite. Yet suspicion lingered. Centuries of poisoned cups had scarred Europe's memory, teaching caution that never truly faded. Even today, fragments of those rituals survive. Diplomats still employ tasters. Heads of state still avoid accepting food from strangers. The shadow of medieval banquets stretches long, reminding us that hospitality once hid daggers sharper than any sword. The most chilling truth. On the battlefield, enemies were clear. At the banquet, betrayal smiled across the table. The man raising a toast to your health might already be planning your funeral. To dine was to gamble, and too often to lose. So the next time you raise a glass in trust, remember your ancestors envied that simple act. They lived in a world where every meal could be a death sentence, every feast a battlefield without banners. And ask yourself, what horrors do we still ignore today, hidden behind the rituals we dare not question? Like, share, and comment to uncover more shadows of history. And never forget how deadly a dinner could be.